Hello, my name is Bim, and I am reading Oscar's first impressions of Ghostwire Tokyo. We got an early look at Ghostwire Tokyo, and here I'll be sharing some of my thoughts about the first few hours of the game. I fixed my sights on Ghostwire Tokyo since its reveal back in E3 2019. Shinji Mikami's name, plus this being a new IP, plus the art direction and setting were all solid contributing factors. Granted, when later trailers trickled in and revealed the first person's perspective, I was taken aback a little bit, but nevertheless decided to give it the benefit of the doubt. We play as the 22-year-old student Akito, who was literally just some random guy passed out on the road after getting himself into a car accident while en route to visit his sister in the hospital. On the flip side, we have a wandering spirit, later revealing his codename to be KK, who ends up possessing Akito. The two would go on to banter for a bit as they find themselves amid an otherworldly Tokyo. Citizens have disappeared, there's a mysterious hazardous fog, and aggressive spirits have begun to overrun the city. This is a classic dynamic where one character is more innocent and ignorant, at least to the haunting developments in the city, while the other is a more seasoned, experienced entity, or consciousness in this case, who knows a bit more than he lets on. KK becomes the source of Akito's fancy elemental powers, and to further their own individual agendas, have decided to stick together to survive the ghoulish city. I will admit I feel a little bamboozled. I thought Ghostwire Tokyo was more of an enclosed, tightly knit experience rather than an open world game. Chapter 1 is very linear and short, with plenty of dangerous fog, hurting and directing your progress. Acceptably so, since it's practically just a tutorial chapter. The game does begin opening up in scale right in the middle of Chapter 2. One gripe I have about exploration quality of life is there doesn't seem to be a way to do a quick turn. The default speed for the camera controls is already perfectly slow for me, for when I just want to look up or down or left, right, but not when I'm trying to do a 180. A bit weird there's no quick turn button, especially since there's literally an unused button on the D-pad. In Chapter 2, I unlocked one of the features I've been dreading for a while, spectral vision, also known as Batman mode. This type of mechanic in itself, being able to see through walls, has always felt fairly lazy to me. I'm of the opinion that it's more rewarding to organically signpost things in the world, looking at environmental clues to figure out that there's stuff to be found, instead of just outright letting the player see through walls. I eventually just gave it the benefit of the doubt, especially given the amount of quote-unquote nothing you have to collect throughout the world. It's the open world sickness after all. Later on, the puzzle becomes figuring out the route to get to something, and not so much just figuring out that there is something in the first place. Or due to the fact that ether deposits are so abundant and come in the form of literally any random object, it turns into a game of recognizing silhouettes and distinguishing potentially unique ones. What I didn't expect in terms of exploration is that there's a huge amount of verticality to the level design. Fairly early on, you get the ability to grapple onto flying tengu and use them as anchor points to hoist yourself up to nearby rooftops. Once above, the exploration opens up quite a bit as you jump from rooftop to rooftop using your short glide ability, which the game introduces alongside the grapple mechanic. The city map doesn't give you too much info in terms of the narrow pathways and alleys. The main roads are clearly defined, but the verticality is something you have to figure out by surveying the lay of the land yourself, so plus points to them for that. So far, my impression of its open world is that its biggest redeeming quality is how much the player enjoys just having a virtual tour of Tokyo. Plenty of stuff to find and interact with, but the rewards are largely meh. Often it's just money or XP. At least you get nice cultural flavor text. Having collectibles just for the sake of collectibles is barely decent game design, and enjoying it more as a walking sim than a game isn't very promising. Almost all of your basic attacks are projectiles, but plenty of the action happens in the mid-range. Plenty of your back and forth with the enemy happens actually mid or even close range. It's not like your usual shooter where you have enemies in the far off distance. It's not fast-paced or twitchy. It doesn't require pinpoint accuracy even though you are rewarded for it. The aim assist also works well enough, and again, given the typical range, enemies are often a pretty big target. Potentially hot take. I feel like instead of a shooter, this feels more like a first-person melee game, except that your melee range is extra long, like Dalsin. This is especially emphasized by the fact that most enemies will attempt to melee you to death while you play Keep Out. Not to mention that you have a block/parry button. You do have an actual melee button, but it's really just a situational shove. Your main offensive tools come in the form of 3 different elements, each serving a specific purpose. Your wind attacks are your basic light attacks. They're fast and linear. Your water attacks are wider and can easily hit multiple enemies. And finally, your fire attacks are strong, explosive, and could potentially knock enemies down. You could also charge these attacks to improve their power and slightly alter their utility. In terms of secondary tools, you get a bow and arrow and talismans. Bows are good for pinpoint, one-shot kills, but their ammo is much more limited than your basic attacks. And as of the time of writing, I've only gotten the stun talisman, and as the name suggests, it briefly stuns enemies caught within its AoE. Blocking seems to have a 50 or 60% damage reduction, at least on hard, which gives me pretty good incentive to simply go for parries. Parries are fairly easy to pull off, and attempting one doesn't leave you super wide open. You just have to block immediately before your enemy attack lands. Successful parries give you a super cool animation. On hard, most melee hits eat like 70 to 80% of your health, so actively zoning and going for parries go a long way. The skill tree is very basic, barely a tree. You can see all the skills that are further down the path, killing any sort of magical wonderment you may have on what sort of surprises combat could have in store for you. Some of the higher tier skills are locked behind Magatama, key items you could find as you progress through the world by doing side quests and missions. Your main resources are food and drinks to replenish your health, and ether to replenish your magic. Ether deposits are abundant in the streets and during enclosed fights, while food and drinks are slightly rarer. Interestingly, each health item gives a small, permanent boost to your max HP. You can also do stealth kills. The sneaking around is surprisingly decent. The enemy AI is competent at spotting you even from far away, so it's important to angle yourself and stay low. I haven't tried, but it might be possible to scum them out by moving out of their range, since they do seem to leash, and attempting to stealth again. Even if I can stealth them, I usually just reveal myself because I want to practice the combat a little bit more. In terms of UI, there's plenty of options to turn off individual elements. I initially wanted to turn off the objective markers, but it turns out the option to do so also turns off the markers for interactable objects. Kind of a bummer. I later realized that objective markers were something I wouldn't mind being on the screens too much anyway. We have a mode for quality and performance, your usual 30 and 60 FPS fare, respectively. And surprisingly, outside of these two, we also have an HFR mode, also known as high frame rate mode. I do wonder about the benchmarks on this though, because even on the standard performance mode, the game seems to struggle in specific areas. As for your difficulty settings, there are 4. Easy, normal, hard, and Tatari. While I'm usually tempted to go for the highest one during the first run, the description for Tatari says you don't get any XP. So it seems to me that's something that you'd want to reserve for a subsequent playthrough. And yes, you can pet dogs and you can attempt to pet the cat. The mechanic doesn't feel all too shoehorned either, since most, if not all other humans have vanished from Tokyo. Yokai and animals are essentially your NPCs. Through KK's spectral power, you can read the minds of the ordinary animals. Sometimes they even give you tips. Giving dog food to the dogs will cause the dog to return the favor by leading you to a pile of money or other miscellaneous secrets. Photo mode is a little bare. Filter, emote, FOV, those are the main things you can adjust. Emote is for your character's expression, which is only available during selfie mode. One odd thing is that despite being a single player game, the world does not pause when you enter photo mode. The first I've encountered of this kind. Overall feelings so far? During the first few dozen minutes, I really felt so hyped that this was every bit as cool as I expected. Towards the middle though, it started getting a little dodgy. Eventually, I just felt bamboozled that this was actually an open world game rather than a tightly knit experience. Another part of me also just wants to get good at the combat. I want to learn about what to use, how to use it, how to consistently stagger enemies, things to do after parrying, when to melee, how to effectively deal with groups, and details of each enemy type, etc. All by doing, of course. Everything else though, the things you can do in the open world feel thin so far, substance-wise. I'm hoping more variation is introduced as you progress, or the sense of reward is improved. I guess we'll see as we play on.